Hello everybody, I thought I'd just give you a tour of the shed and hopefully describe some bits that we've done with the lathe. Here's the ML4 in all its splendour glory. Lathe shaft set up there. We'll start with the motor at the back. So you've got the motor at the back, there's an oil feed there into the spindle. This is connected to a belt and obviously a larger pulley onto the shaft, which is connected to a smaller pulley to the lathe. The wires are run down the back of the bench underneath, and there'll be a start stop with a big emergency button somewhere about knee height, so if anything happens I should be able to get my knee on that and knock the lathe off. Moving forward, we need to get some stoppers or even oil caps for the tops of here. These horrible nasty bolts are going to get sawn off. All I'll do is I'll clean them and just put a pen mark on where the top of this bush is, and then I'll just saw, using the vise, I'll just saw a slit into the top, so I can just tighten it up with a screwdriver, which will eliminate anyone shouting at me for doing that, which you can see with a loose sleeve gets caught in there, it's going to wrap you up, and yeah, not very pretty. So spindle, we had the spindle out. A lot of people have commented on the headstock and making sure that the headstock is right, the spindle, everything's adjusted up here absolutely properly, because if anything else you do is going to be a waste of time. So the spindle was pulled out, we undid this clamp here, took the gear off. These are connected by a small pin. Don't lose the pin or you'll be finding some more wire to make another pin. And then if we just rotate that, you can see a small slotted screw there. That grub screw gets undone, wound out, and off the end of the spindle. In here we have a small grub screw. That's a imperial grub screw, not a metric. So obviously, like a lot of things on this lathe, your lathes might be different, it might all been uprated and new bolts and new threads, and over the 70-80 years of these things being in existence, there's a lot of different modifications to them. Grub screw was taken out and the spindle was just gently tapped by hand to bring it out enough so that we could measure what the diameter of this spindle was inside the sleeve. Inside here is just a bronze sleeve, with a slot that matches the gap along the front edge. So we measured that in various places around the circumference. That was found to be 1/1000 under 1 inch, so the nominal 1 inch spindle is correct. A lot of people have commented that if these aren't adjusted correctly, that basically your headstock will crack, and you're not gonna, without having to machine this entire top section off on a mill, which means unbolting all of this section from about here upwards, putting it on a mill and taking everything from about here out, which is a big operation. You don't want to do that. It'd be a big expense if you haven't got a friend with a mill. Let's take the oil cup out in a minute. Inside there you've got a grub screw. This is just a clamp. This just clamps down pressure and applies pressure to the top of the bearing so that you can keep the bearing itself, with it having a slit along the front, absolutely round, and that spindle stays in a round bearing as opposed to in an oval bearing, which obviously at some point or other it has done because we have found wear on the bearings. Next job for me is to make up some shims for the front and rear casting. at the moment I've got these feeler gauges that were bought for £6 from Screwfix. Not massively dear, but they do come in quite a lot of different sizes. And if I can get the camera to focus right on there, you can see various different sizes, thicknesses, and it does go down to even half a thou. I don't know where that one is at the moment. Oh, it's in there. So it goes down to even like half thou increments. If I can get it to focus. It will focus on there eventually, thank you very much. So you can see half thou increments on there, and basically it's just a case of nipping these bolts down onto this until your spindle goes tight, but not too tight that you can't turn the thing. It wants to be able, with this belt off, to be able to rotate this spindle by hand. Any looser, it's no good. Any tighter, you risk a crack appearing along the weakest point, which is this here. All the pressure from tightening down tightly on this bearing here, that's the weakest point, and that's where it'll crack, because you've got two holes in there, so the casting is not complete, and away it goes. So I'll be making some shims to fit this shape here. Literally just unbolt this, take the feeler gauge out, put a piece of paper in, draw around it, and then it's a case of just cutting a couple of pieces of brass and getting the thickness that's measured on these feeler gauges. When it's done, these bolts can be nipped back up. I got told off I had them too tight, even though I've got the feeler gauges in, still had them too tight. So gentle pressure just to nip them on, don't need anything more. And then again, the spindle lock at the back here, this adjusts your forward and backwards motion. So what you want to do is get a dial indicator mounted on face here, clock it in, push the spindle forward and backwards using gear, spindle, whatever you want to use, just get the movement forward and backwards, and take out that movement by screwing this in, basically just tightening this up. And once you've got that tight enough, you'll have no movement. If you over tighten it, then obviously you're putting too much pressure on your bearings, and it won't be any good for the lathe. Tighten that up, and there's your headstock adjusted and your lathe shaft set up. The last bit to look at on the headstock is the back gears. So to engage the back gears, you'll find your grub screw in there, which locks the pulley to the spindle. Take that out, and on this gear somewhere, I'll just back it up a bit, on this gear somewhere you will find a little hole. Now in that hole is where your grub screw goes. So you've taken the grub screw out of the pulley, you put it in here, and somewhere on that spindle you'll see a little dimple where the grub screw's been inserted, and that locks this gear to the spindle and leaves the pulley locked to this gear, which is free to rotate on the spindle, which engages this gear, which is connected to this gear, which is then driving the bull gear, which is connected to the spindle. So that's your back gears there, and it's simply a case to disengage them. Take your lever off there, that's just a cam lock on the back. So take your lever off, tighten that back up so that it doesn't, perhaps if I focus on what I'm doing. Tighten that back up and yeah, take your grub screw out of here, put it back in there and locate it onto another dimple that's found just underneath the pulley there. And then there's your headstock set up and hunky-dory.